I bet that employee giving you the biggest headache during your change initiative is actually the one who cares the most. The one that's asking the difficult questions, the one that's challenging the plan, the one everyone keeps calling resistant. Now, I know that probably sounds backwards, but think about it. What if they're not trying to stop the change? What if they're worried you're about to lose something valuable? Because every change creates gains, but also every change creates losses. Even good change, even the necessary change, the strategic change. There's always something changing, which means always something ending and always something being left behind. And sometimes the people pushing back on your newest initiative aren't resisting the future. They're trying to protect something valuable from being lost along the way. What's interesting is that this type of resistance doesn't always start here. In the video, Your Best Employee Resists Change First, and here's why, we explored intelligence resistance. The resistance that said, I see something you don't. What happens when those concerns aren't heard, though? What happens when people feel like no one is listening to them? Often, that intelligence resistance evolves into something else. It becomes protective resistance. The resistance that says, I'm worried we're about to lose something important. And if leaders fail to understand what people are trying to protect, they may miss those insights that could strengthen the change itself. And that's what we're talking about today. The hidden reason good employees fight new initiatives. And why one of the most important leadership responses isn't persuasion, it's acknowledgement. If we haven't met before, I'm Teena, founder of Change Decoded. I've spent my career helping leaders turn ambitious visions into lasting results, guiding teams through technology transformations, acquisitions, organizational change, and periods of significant growth. And if there's one thing those experiences have taught me, it's this. Transformation isn't something that happens to an organization. It happens through its people, because organizations don't transform, but the people do. And when people respond to change, they're often communicating information. And that's the foundation of Resistance Decoder, a framework designed to help leaders understand what different forms of resistance are actually trying to tell us. In this series, we're exploring the different resistance themes and the leadership responses that help decode them. Today's theme is protective resistance, the resistance that says, I don't want us to lose something valuable. And the leadership response is simple: acknowledge. Because before people can embrace what is changing, they often need confidence that what matters today has been seen, understood, and thoughtfully considered. Before we dive in, I just want to let you know that I've created a change agent toolkit to help leaders identify resistance signals and respond more effectively during transformation. To get this free download, go ahead and use the link in the description below. One of the biggest misconceptions about resistance is that it often comes from people who don't care. In my experience, protective resistance often comes from the exact opposite. It comes from the people who care deeply. The people who built the process, who serve the customers, who know the history, they know the why they're doing things today a certain way. They are the people who have helped create the success that you're trying to build upon. When they raise concerns, they often are asking a simple question. What are we giving up in exchange for this change? And I believe that's a fair question, because every change creates gains, but every change also creates losses. Even when the change is absolutely the right decision, the reality is that every transformation creates trade-off. And often the people closest to the work can see those trade-offs before leadership does. One of the reasons I find the Resistance Decoder so valuable is that these themes don't always exist independently. They often actually connect. Think about someone who raises a concern early. They've identified a risk, they've pointed out a potential consequence, they share acknowledge from their experiences, and they're demonstrating intelligent resistance. They're saying, I see something you don't. But what happens when they start feeling dismissed? They feel unheard, and they feel like their expertise isn't valued. That conversation often changes. It now moves from, I see a risk, to I'm worried we're going to lose something important. And now that resistance becomes protective. They're no longer simply identifying a concern. They're trying to protect something they believe that creates value. And the longer people feel unheard, the more strongly they often feel compelled to defend it. That's why listening early matters. Not because leaders must agree with every concern, but because understanding concerns early often presents resistance from growing later. When leaders hear resistance, they often focus on the objection. But protective resistance usually points to something deeper. People may be protecting the customer relationships that they've worked hard to gain, the team culture that they love so much, or the ways that they've been working that have contributed to their success along the way. Sometimes they're protecting something leadership hasn't considered. Sometimes what they're protecting is something leadership has already considered and have accepted the trade-offs. And sometimes what they're protecting is actually something that the organization intentionally hopes to move away from. The challenge is that until we understand what they're trying to protect, we don't know which situation we're dealing with. And that's why curiosity matters, because protective resistance isn't necessarily saying, don't change. It's often saying, don't lose something important. One of the reasons leaders miss protective resistance is because it rarely announces itself. Nobody walks into a meeting and says, hello everyone, I'm experiencing protective resistance today. Instead, it shows up in the language people use. This resistance theme is common for individuals who have been a part of an organization or the same team for a long time. Honestly, I fall within this bucket often within my own organization. After being there for 13 years and knowing a lot of the reasons why we do the things we do, I constantly hear myself raising questions like, if we make this change, what happens to our customers? Or what happens to the teams that we work downstream with? In situations like this, people like myself aren't necessarily arguing against the future. They're expressing concern about something they value today. They're trying to protect something, and that's why I encourage leaders to listen for one simple question hidden beneath the concern. What are they afraid we might lose? Because once you understand what people are trying to protect, the conversation becomes much more productive. You're no longer debating the change. You're exploring the value behind the concern. And that's where meaningful dialogue begins. Now let's make this practical. Imagine you're implementing a new software. Of course, leadership is excited and the project team are excited. Why wouldn't they be? The business case is clear, the timeline is set, but then one employee starts pushing back. They keep raising concerns about that customer service. They keep questioning the new process, and they keep talking about expectations that weren't accounted for. The project team starts getting frustrated because from their perspective, they've addressed all of these concerns already, many times. But what happens if that's not what's actually happening? What happens if that employee isn't resisting the system? What happens if they're protecting that customer experience? What happens if they're protecting the response times? And they're protecting the relationships they've spent years building? Now the conversation changes. Instead of asking, how do we get this person on board? We start asking, what are they trying to protect? And that question often leads to much better conversations. Sometimes we discover a legitimate risk. Sometimes we identify a gap in the process design. And sometimes we uncover a misunderstanding. And sometimes simply we create confidence that the concern has been considered. But none of that happens if we just label it as resistance straight from the beginning. This is where many leaders unintentionally make things worse. Someone raises a concern. Leadership immediately responds with explanations. They talk about the timelines, the business case, the project plans, reasons why the decision has already been made. But that's not what the people need first. They don't need more explanation. They need acknowledgement. Acknowledgement doesn't mean agreement. It means recognition. It means saying, I understand why that concerns you. I see why that matters, and that is an important perspective. Thank you for raising it. Because people don't always need immediate agreement. They just need evidence that their perspective was genuinely considered. When people feel heard, they're often more willing to explore possibilities. But when people feel ignored, they tend to become more protective, and that's when resistance intensifies. The reason this matters so much is because protective resistance doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It simply changes form. At first, people raise concerns, then they repeat the concerns, and then they become frustrated. Eventually, many people stop speaking up altogether, and leaders often misinterpret this silence as buy-in. But silence is not always agreement, and sometimes silence is just resignation. People have decided, they've already made up their mind, no one wants to hear this, and why bother saying anything? And that's a dangerous place for transformation to be. Because organizations need people who care enough to challenge assumptions. Organizations need people who notice risks, and organizations need people who are willing to ask the difficult questions. The goal isn't to eliminate concern. The goal is to actually create an environment where concerns can be explored productively. Because when people stop speaking up, leaders lose access to information. And information is exactly what resistance has been trying to provide all along. And now, once you've truly understood the concern, several things may be true. Perhaps they've identified something genuinely valuable, and your plan needs adjustment. Perhaps they've highlighted a risk that you hadn't fully considered yet, and adjusting it makes the change stronger. Perhaps the loss can be mitigated along the way, and you can help people understand how that value will be preserved. Perhaps it's a trade-off you've already considered, and you're openly acknowledging that every decision involves pros and cons. You recognize that there's no perfect plan, only informed choices, or perhaps there's a misunderstanding. Maybe the thing they're worried about losing is actually something the organization intentionally hopes to leave behind. And even then, acknowledgement still matters, because people deserve to know their concerns were heard, understood, and thoughtfully considered, not dismissed. The biggest shift protective resistance asks us to make as a leader is this: stop asking, how do I overcome resistance? And start asking, what is this person trying to protect? Because the answer to that question often reveals information that can improve the change itself. Organizations need people who care enough to raise concerns. They need people who challenge assumptions. They need people willing to protect what creates value. The goal isn't to silence those voices. The goal is to understand them. The people fighting hardest for something may actually be helping you build something better. The next time someone pushes back on that new initiative, pause before labeling it resistance. Ask yourself, what might they be trying to protect? What value are they afraid will lose? What information might be hidden inside this concern? Because protective resistance isn't usually saying don't change. It's often saying don't lose something important. And sometimes that message appears because an earlier concern was never fully heard. That's why acknowledgement is such a powerful leadership skill. It doesn't just help you understand today's concern, it helps you prevent tomorrow's resistance. If this video was helpful, subscribe to the channel and download the free Change Agent Toolkit using the link in the description. And let me know in the comments, what's something valuable you've seen employees trying to protect during a change initiative? Until next time, resistance is information. Every response to change is a signal. The job of a leader is to decode the message, and I'm here to help. Let's decode change together and lead change inside and out.